So, how do you rebuild an economy from complete and utter collapse? In 1994, Rwanda's economy literally fell by 50% in a single year. I mean, it was barely a country at all. And yet today, people are comparing it to one of the most successful economies in modern history, Singapore. But before we get into why, we need to be crystal clear about just how massive that gap still is.
And let's be real, it's not a gap, it's a chasm. GDP per capita, which is basically a rough measure of a country's economic output per person, is over $90,000 in Singapore. In Rwanda, it's about $1,000. The economic reality on the ground, still worlds apart.
So that brings us to the big question, right? The one we're going to tackle in this explainer. Why on earth is anyone even making this comparison? Well, the answer isn't about where Rwanda is today. It's about the audacious plan it's following and where it is desperately trying to go.
All right, here's the game plan. First, we'll really unpack that Singapore comparison. Then, we're going to rewind to the beginning to understand Rwanda's journey from ashes to ambition. We'll look at the pro-business playbook they're running, but we'll also face the hard truth about geography's limits and ask if this whole thing is built on a fragile foundation before we reach our final verdict.
Okay, let's dive right in. Why does this comparison even exist? Well, it's not about the current numbers, it's all about the trajectory and the model. Rwanda has very consciously decided to follow in Singapore's footsteps.
And this table, this right here, tells you the whole story. It is all about the direction of travel. After the genocide in 1994, Rwanda's economy basically ceased to exist. Today, life expectancy has more than doubled, and its average GDP growth is actually faster than a developed economy like Singapore's. And get this, it's now easier to start a business in Rwanda than in some European countries. The progress is just stunning, even if the destination is still a long way off.
To really get that progress, you have to understand the starting point. In 1994, the new government under Paul Kagame didn't just inherit a developing economy. They inherited, well, nothing. A void. The institutions were gone, the infrastructure was destroyed, the country had just stopped.
Think about this number for a second. A 50% drop in GDP in 1 year. That's not a recession, that's an economic black hole. The first priority wasn't growth, it was simply creating a country again, focusing on stability above all else.
And that stability, well, it became the foundation for a very deliberate path forward. For a while, in the late 90s, foreign aid acted as a kind of scaffolding, holding things up while they rebuilt basic services. But in 2000, the government launched Vision 2020, a huge plan to shift from being dependent on aid to becoming a self-sufficient, knowledge-based economy.
And this chart shows you just how serious they were about that shift. By professionalizing its tax collection, Rwanda totally flipped its budget. Back in 2000, over 60% of the budget was paid for by foreign aid. By 2017, over 60% was funded by their own domestic revenue. That fiscal independence was the launchpad for everything that happened next.
So with that newfound stability, and crucially, their own money, they could move on to the next phase, a conscious effort to completely rebrand the country, to change the story from one of genocide to one of opportunity.
And that rebranding was backed by real, tangible reforms. Look at this jump in the World Bank's ease of doing business ranking. It's one of the largest and most sustained in history. You don't go from 140th to 38th in just over a decade by accident. No way. That's the result of relentless, focused reform.
So what does that pro-business stuff mean in practice? Well, it looks like this. In 2005, it took almost a full year to register a property. A year. Today, it takes a week. An entrepreneur can now register an entire business, all online, in just 6 hours. That's what it looks like on the ground.
And if this strategy sounds familiar, well, it should be. It's pulled directly from Singapore's playbook. Just like Lee Kuan Yew built a corruption-free, pro-trade hub to make Singapore indispensable to Southeast Asia, Paul Kagame is positioning Rwanda as a low-corruption, stable base for businesses that want to tap into the markets of East and Central Africa.
So Rwanda is perfectly executing the Singapore Playbook on internal policy. But here's where that comparison hits a wall, a literal physical one. Rwanda faces a massive challenge that no amount of reform can ever fix: its geography.
Singapore's greatest asset is its port. Rwanda, famously, has no port. Being landlocked imposes a massive tax on absolutely everything. And the numbers here are just jaw-dropping. It costs almost 3 times more to get a container from the port in Mombasa to Kigali than it does to ship it all the way from Shanghai in the first place.
And to get goods inland, you're choosing between 2 bad options. The shorter, central corridor is vulnerable to political shocks in neighboring countries. The northern corridor is agonizingly slow, plagued by border delays, roadblocks, and hundreds of dollars in unofficial fees just to keep your cargo moving. It's a logistical nightmare.
Okay, so beyond geography, there are other cracks starting to show in this otherwise impressive foundation. The long-term success of this Singapore model depends on things like human capital, a diverse export base, and stable leadership. And on all 3 of those fronts, Rwanda's facing some really serious questions.
And these vulnerabilities are significant. First, there's the human capital gap. You can't really build a knowledge economy when only 9% of your young adults have gone to college or university. Second, the export base is fragile. It relies heavily on minerals like gold, and there are persistent questions about whether that gold is actually sourced from within Rwanda. And finally, the elephant in the room. This whole system has been built around one man. What happens after President Kagame?
All of this is happening while the country is taking on massive debt to fund its ambitions. We're talking about huge projects like a new $1.3 billion international airport that are pushing public debt to over 73% of GDP. And the IMF is warning it could hit 86% by 2027.
So that brings us to the final verdict. What Rwanda has achieved is genuinely remarkable. It has built an incredible foundation from absolute ruins. But a foundation is not a skyscraper, and the hardest part is what comes next.
This question gets right to the heart of Rwanda's gamble. See, Singapore built its world-class port because the trade was already there. Rwanda is building its world-class airport in the hope that the trade will come. It's a classic if you build it, they will come strategy. It's putting the runway before the planes.
But there is one external event that could make this entire gamble pay off big time: the African Continental Free Trade Area. The goal here is to create a single market across the whole continent, making it as easy to trade between, say, Kampala and Kigali as it is between Paris and Berlin. If Africa's internal borders truly start to fall, Rwanda's biggest geographic disadvantage could finally start to fade.
And that leaves us with the final question. Rwanda has built one of the most remarkable economic recovery stories in modern history, an impressive boat by any measure. But whether it truly becomes the Singapore of Africa might depend less on its own incredible efforts and more on whether the rising tide of continental trade is strong enough to lift it.